Hey guys, how are we all? Welcome back to the Twister Bones podcast. My name is Megan, and every single week I sit down and I read and react to a bunch of scary, spooky, horrifying and weird stories that range from ghosts and the supernatural to real life encounters with creepy people or potentially dangerous people. So like always, before I do actually get into this week's stories, I just want to quickly go over some housekeeping. So firstly, I will always credit the people who wrote these stories, so all of the information will be in the description of each episode. So if you want to go and support those content creators, feel free to check the links out below. And finally, if you have your own scary story, whether that be an encounter with a stalker or your own paranormal ghost sort of story, and you want it to feature in a future episode, please reach out and send your story over to me. I would absolutely love to read it out. You can do this by either using my Facebook page, which is just Twister Bones Podcast, or you can email it to twisterbonespod@gmail.com, or you can actually head on over to Reddit. I've got a subreddit over there just called Twister Bones Podcast, where you can write it out and leave it there, and hopefully I will be able to read it out in a future episode. But apart from that, let's get into this week's stories. So we've got a mini theme this week, and it is kind of along the lines of imaginary friends. See, kids and children are supposed to be really, is it susceptible? Why can't I say that word? They are a lot more prone to being able to see ghosts and things like that, and a lot of the time people do think that imaginary friends aren't just imaginary, that they could actually be ghosts. So I find this little topic pretty interesting. So I'm going to once again be reading from the yourghoststories.com website. Like I said at the beginning, all the links will be down below. But this first one is written by Courtney22 and it's called Imaginary Friend. I'm a lover of all things paranormal. It has interested me my whole life. However, I've not had many first-hand experiences or encounters with the paranormal. Besides one. I was young, maybe 5 years old at the most. I lived in a 2-story apartment in Dayton, Ohio with my mother and father at the time. It was before my sister was born. I am going on 26 years old, remember. It seems over the year everything becomes more and more fuzzy, like I'm trying to tune the static out of an old TV. But I will always remember this about living in this apartment. I had an imaginary friend. I remember having an imaginary friend, very distinctly. My imaginary friend was a boy. He didn't have a name that I can recall. But I remember locking myself in my room for hours and playing, jumping on the bed, playing with dolls, talking to him. But that is the extent of what I can remember about him. It wouldn't be until years later, after we moved from that apartment and I was older, that my parents would share a story with me that haunts me to this day. They knew I had an imaginary friend. It was all I did day in and day out. I developed this imaginary friend after we'd moved into this apartment. And according to my parents, I started doing bad things. Things that I didn't normally do prior to having this imaginary friend. I would have accidents on myself and pee on the floor in my room like a dog. I would lock my cats in the trunk that sat outside of my door in the hallway. My attitude and the way I talked to my mother seemed to get worse too. When confronted about my actions and the things that I was doing, they said I would blame it on my cousin Amber, who had never even been over before. My mother in particular has always told me that she hated my room in that apartment. She hated to be in my room by herself, as she would always feel as if something was watching her. There was one day in particular where things got really strange. My father was working a 3rd shift job at the time. He'd worked some overtime that day and came home and wanted to go to sleep. He walked up the stairs, past my room where my door was shut, and into his room across the hall. My parents' story about what happened has never faltered or changed, as many times as I have heard it. My dad could hear me in my room playing with what seemed to be another kid. He heard 2 voices. I suppose I could have easily been replying to myself in different tones to give my imaginary friend a voice, except he claims there were times our voices overlapped, and he could clearly tell he was hearing 2 different children, laughing, playing, and just being kids. He called my mother to come to their room so that he could tell her to go and tell me and that neighbour boy to keep it down so he could sleep. My mother insisted that she did not hear anyone else with me, and that there was no other kids in the room except for me. And sure enough, when they checked, I was alone. I'm not sure when we ended up moving from that apartment, but we did. My parents claimed, like flipping a switch, as soon as we moved out, I no longer had an imaginary friend. I could not sit here and tell you that yes, it was a ghost, because, well, I just don't know. I for sure know and remember the imaginary friend. I can't ever recall that anything weird ever happened to me during this time, like hearing him or seeing him. I only remember the act of acting like there was someone with me to play with and speaking at this thing that I could not see. But to my parents, there was definitely something more than just a child playing make-believe. To top it all off, a few years later, a friend of my dad's moved into the same apartment with his daughter and son. They knew nothing of the experience we had in the home. Imagine how my parents felt to learn that this friend's daughter took my old room, and a few weeks upon moving in, she had her very own imaginary friend. She continued to have an imaginary friend until the day that they too moved from the house. This story is one of my most prized possessions. When the topic of ghosts is on the table, it is the one I whip out. It is eerie and somewhat unsettling, but it's 100% true. This apartment is relatively close to where my grandparents currently live and have lived for many, many years. And over all these years, there's been a handful of occasions where we have drove or walked past it, and I find that every single time, I find myself looking up into the window of what used to be my old room, wondering if he might be looking back at me and remember me. I think that that's potentially a little ghost haunting. I mean, it could have been an imaginary friend, but it's a bit bizarre that other people have had similar encounters with their children. I don't know, you'll have to let me know what you think about that one. But I'm going to move on to my next one. And this is called Michael the Imaginary Friend. It's a little bit of a shorter one, and this was written by Casey. Michael was an imaginary friend that I interacted with from a very young age. He must have appeared at about the age of 4, and when I began to grow up, I gradually mentioned him less and less. As my family are very strong paranormal and spirit believers, an imaginary friend was no surprise, and they accepted it. I used to talk about Michael as if he was really there, and I'd describe his dress attire to my mum as Victorian. Now in the present, I can't remember what he looked like or what he specifically dressed in, but I remember clearly some experiences I had with him. When we lived in this house, I grew up in it until I was around the age of 7. My room had a cupboard that had shelves leading right up to the top. I'm not sure if people from different countries will know about this, but I had cuddly toys that were the tweenies. One day I was playing with Michael and I began to cry because I couldn't find one of my tweenies, Milo. I told my mum and said to her that Michael had hidden it in a place where I couldn't get it, in the cupboard, on the topmost shelf. My mum opened the cupboard and sure enough, my toy was sitting on the top shelf, which would have been impossible to get to. Once, my family were around my grandparents and the adults were all in the kitchen while I was in the living room. I had toys all over the floor, which included a colouring book and crayons. My mum and grandmother came into the room to find the walls had been covered with crayon scribbles. I got told off for it, even though I'd been quietly watching a film, and I insisted it was Michael. Finally, my mother and her friend, a woman very sensitive to the paranormal world, had taken me out shopping. Whilst paying for something, my mother placed me on the counter and my legs began swinging wildly. My mum told me to stop as it was causing a scene, but her friend quietly told her that I couldn't stop, because Michael was playing with my legs, and he wouldn't stop. I've never had any bad experiences with Michael. I believe he was merely a playful spirit. And that is the end of that one. Yes, I do know what tweenies are. I grew up watching the tweenies. I used to absolutely love it. If you don't, have a quick look on YouTube. It's so interesting to see what kids' TV shows were like back in the day compared to now. I say back in the day. It wasn't that long ago. But interesting. Very, very interesting. It's odd that this ghost seemed to be, or potential ghost, seemed to be attached to you specifically and not your house. The fact that you were out shopping and he's potentially followed you. That's a little bit scary, isn't it? But we're going to move on to the next one. This is by Annie Louise and it's called My Imaginary Friend. When I was younger, around 3, my dad was walking our dog in a park. My dad's side of the family has always been sensitive to ghosts and such, so he could tell something was following him, but he didn't put much thought into it, thinking it was just curious about the dog or something. And when he'd got home, he'd pretty much forgotten about it. About 2 weeks later, my mum started complaining about feeling something in the basement, and a shadow on the wall following her along the walls, one that wasn't her own shadow. And sure enough, soon I started hanging out with a little girl named Samantha or something. For a few weeks we played peacefully, and my dad didn't care. But one day I started jabbering about how Samantha said she was going to burn our house down. My dad was worried, obviously, that she might be a harmful spirit, so he went down to the basement to talk to her, and as he did, he started to feel something behind him. He turned around, and a little girl of about 7 was behind him. She looked perfectly normal, but she had fire around her. I say fire because it wasn't really there, more like a ghostly image. She looked angry and walked off into the furnace room. Yeah, I know, how stereotypical. My dad was mad and concerned at this point and forced the spirit out of the house. For a little while I was sad, but I got over it pretty quickly. Does anyone think this was more of a wandering spirit? Or perhaps it was something evil? To give you an idea of our basement, one half of the garage and the stairs were in the middle. It was unfinished. So you walk down the stairs and you are facing the outermost wall. The garage is on your right and a regular basement is on your left. In the back of the regular basement was an odd storeroom that was always cold, a furnace room, and other little utility closets. As a child, I was fine with going into the basement alone, but never went to the second floor alone. The only time I went up there was with the cat or another person. I often had nightmares and was deathly afraid of the closet upstairs. The reason that this is important is that I was fine with going up there with Samantha, so it wasn't just a childish fantasy. She was real, or I wouldn't go up there. Ooh, that one's interesting. See, personally, I would want to look into your house's background or potentially the area your house was built on, because she could have been, I don't know, a young kid who was killed in a house fire maybe. I don't know. That one's very odd, but very interesting at the same time. But that is all the ghost stories for this week. I do really enjoy hearing about child-related hauntings, as in like kids that can see ghosts and stuff, because I find it so interesting. So I potentially might do some more imaginary ghost stories next week. You'll have to let me know if you guys enjoyed them. But thank you so much for listening this week. Like I mentioned at the start, if you do have your own story that you would like me to read out, please reach out and send it over to me. I would absolutely love to read it out. But apart from that, in the meantime, if you want to keep up with me, you can head on over to my Instagram, which is just at Alien Queen Meg, and we can keep up with each other over there. But apart from that, I will catch you in my next one. Stay spooky, guys.